Welcome back. You are currently watching the second video of a series I've been working on called Repeating Handguns 1836 through 2025. In this episode I will be covering the period between 1851, when Colt's revolver patent expired in Europe, and 1872, the last year before the release of the Colt single-action army would change the course of American and even European repeating firearms permanently. Before 1851, repeating handguns were mostly a concept exclusive to the Anglosphere, particularly America, but also Britain to some extent. The vast majority of early revolvers were manufactured by Colt's Manufacturing Company in factories across America and Britain, including the famous Paterson, New Jersey factory and London factories. Since the Colt patent had expired in England by 1851, and Britain wanted to preserve its status as global hegemon following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, it would only make sense that they would want to take advantage of the spoils of their latest colonial exploits by producing their own revolvers, weapons that would truly represent the scale of the empire in a modern way, leaving behind the old Caplock single shots. Without further ado, the last of the pre-Cartridge era. The Dean Adams, or just Adams, series of revolvers were the first domestically produced British revolvers, first produced in 1851. The revolvers are special primarily for the reason that they were the first ever double-action percussion revolvers on the market, something which had not yet been explored by Colt. The development of the Adams prioritized primarily stopping power via the use of calibers from small 32 up to large 50 and 44 variants, primarily as 30 cartridges tended to be viewed as too weak to use in colonial combat. The double action was also created to circumvent the slow action of Colt's single action pistols, to essentially create a jack-of-all-trades revolver for all-purpose colonial ambition. It is also important to note the pistol wasn't a standard issue, it was privately purchased usually. Of course, no first attempt is ever perfect, and the Dean Adams certainly wasn't either. Firstly, it had no recoil shield covering the breech, meaning the user was exposed to fragments of percussion caps and hot gases upon firing the weapon. Secondly, it had poor accuracy due to the lack of hammer, something expressed likely because the hammer resetting itself automatically would have lowered the pressure exerted by the hammer on the percussion caps. Lastly, early models had no loading lever, meaning the rounds could easily become loose and fall out, rendering an Adams user defenseless. Another entry from 1851, the Colt M1851 Navy, is perhaps the most iconic cap and ball revolver ever made. This weapon is quite simple. A 6-shooter chambered for 36 caliber balls, the traditional Navy style cartridge up until the 1870s. The weapon is quite easy to explain, as it is essentially just like its older counterpart, the Colt Dragoon, chambered for 36 caliber balls instead of 44 caliber. This revolver was really where the old American pistol nomenclature for 36 being a Navy/police revolver round and 44 being an Army round developed. The Navy would see production until 1873. Skipping over to 1853, we have the Webley Long Spur. From a name you might recognise, this revolver was the first to be produced by Webley & Son, in the days before they became Webley & Scott. The weapon is quite similar to the Colt revolvers of the time, as it was a single action, albeit with a 5-round cylinder. The weapon chambered 4.55 caliber percussion rounds, and in its earlier forms it had two different types of loading lever, the Adams rammer, so named for the Adams revolver, and the Kerr rammer, which will become important later in the 1850s. The French Le Faucheux M1854 has the distinction of being the first French revolver and also the first revolver to use a metallic cartridge, the 12mm pinfire. Unlike many weapons before it, the Le Faucheux would see an incredibly long lifespan, being used in service all the way up until the end of World War I in 1918, albeit it was not used in World War I itself, and seeing production until 1870. The weapon's cartridge usage was desirable, as it would allow for much faster reloads, and it would later be succeeded by the M1858 variant in the American Civil War later in 1861. Curiously, despite having such a large bore round, the Le Faucheux held 6 rounds. It was initially single action but was converted to double action for civilian usage. It was the first revolver to be used by the Italian Carabinieri, before being replaced later in 1861. The year of 1854 would also see the development of another British revolver. The Tranter series is notable for having a recoil shield and the absurd number of calibers available for the Tranter, from 32 up to 50. The weapon also saw some usage in the Confederate Army to great popularity, largely thanks to its double action trigger. The weapon came in 36 Navy and 44 Army variants for the American civilian market. Going into 1855, Colt's Sidehammer revolver releases with a 5-round capacity of 28 caliber ball ammunition, a single action trigger, and a strange Patterson-style handle with a spur trigger. The spur trigger itself would not be seen again on any Colt models, with the exception of the Colt Derringers of the 1870s and the later Colt House. The weapon can be seen as a late-stage baby Patterson, and saw 30,000 units made of its 28 caliber incarnation and 14,000 for its 31 caliber version. It is sometimes referred to as the Colt Root, thanks to the work of engineer Elisha K. Root. The last development of 1855 would be the volcanic repeating pistol, an extremely famous weapon for a number of reasons. It is commonly and erroneously referred to as the first repeating pistol because of its bizarre lever action, but the likely reason as to why the volcanic is commonly cited as the first repeating pistol with a single chamber is because of its association with Smith & Wesson, as it was technically their first pistol. The volcanic pistol also had a reputation associated with it that was less than desirable. It could not be operated one-handed comfortably due to the lever action's awkward position, and it used proprietary rocket ball rounds, self-contained caseless rounds that were apparently so weak when a man attempted to shoot himself in the head with a volcanic pistol, it allegedly only left him with minor head injuries. It's been said that the volcanic had less stopping power than the 20th century 25 ACP pocket pistol. Forward into 1856, the Webley-Bentley Percussion revolver was released. It was the first Webley double-action revolver, and from here on, all Webley revolvers would be double-action. The weapon held 5 shots and used 36 caliber ball ammunition. The last development before 1857 would be the Lamate revolver, another French revolver but this time with elements both innovative and archaic baked into its design. The only thing it really shares in common with the other French revolver, the Lafouche, was its single-action design. The Lamate was bizarre, not just because it could use 42 caliber rounds, or because it held 9 rounds, but also because it did both of these things while having a 20 gauge barrel under the main pistol barrel for firing shotgun rounds. Despite its clearly outlandish and esoteric design, the Lamate did actually see service in the American Civil War. 1857 would come with the expiration of the Colt patent on the revolving action in the United States, and the Smith & Wesson Model 1 would be the first American revolver since the Collier to be made inside of the USA. Interestingly though, the Smith & Wesson Model 1 skips a generation and goes straight into 22 short rim-fire rounds rather than percussion. It was also the first revolver to use a tip-up assembly to allow for quick extraction. The Smith & Wesson Model 1 was designed for civilian usage, as the 22 short was extremely weak, but as both the American metallic cartridge and the first American revolver to use a metallic cartridge, it's likely the Model 1 scared Colt, because the Smith & Wesson Model 1 was an excellent prediction of what was to come. The use of a spur trigger likely came from the Colt Root, which was released 2 years earlier. It did end up seeing some service in the American Civil War, surprisingly. In the same year, there would be another American repeating pistol to use a 22 short cartridge. While not a revolver, the W.W. Marston triple barrel Derringer would be the first pistol to really try and copy the Smith & Wesson Model 1's formula. While it had a tip-down assembly rather than a tip-up, it still had these features which made it very similar to the Model 1. 22 short ammunition, a single-action design, and a spur trigger. The year of 1858 would see 4 new developments, 1 French and 3 American. To start with, the Lafouche M1858 needs no introduction. This revolver is essentially just the military version of the M1854 Lafouche, and the M1858 would go to see use with countries around the world. Denmark, Sweden, Japan, China, France, Brazil, both sides during the American Civil War, and Spain. For these countries it was their first cartridge-using revolver, and in France, the Lafouche would see service until 1873, when it was replaced by the Maz 1873 revolver. The year also saw the development of 2 American double-action revolvers, the Star and the Pettingill. The Star is more famous primarily due to the fact that it was the first of the 2 and had variants in both 36 and 44 caliber, making it ideal for American military usage. The Pettingill was weird in that it didn't have an exposed hammer like the Star, and so was double action only. The Pettingill is also more obscure because it shunned convention by using a 34 caliber ball, likely making it unpopular for naval and police use. The Star revolver had around 47,500 units made, while the Pettingill only had around 3,400. Making the Star the 3rd most produced revolver of the American Civil War. The final development of 1858 would be its most famous, and the gun most associated with the number, the Remington New Model Army of 1858. The Remington M1858 would first see service in 1861, and came in all 3 of the popular round types established by Colt in the late 1840s, 44 for Army, 36 for Navy and Police, and 31 for civilians. It was as standard a single-action shooter as any, but it would go on to see service usage in Russia, Japan, Mexico, and in many British territories like Canada and Australia. During the Colt factory fire of 1864, many Colt revolvers would not be produced for the Union Army, and the M1858 would briefly take over as the main revolver of the Union. 1859 is likely the most bizarre year yet, as all developments around this time were unconventional for the standards of the time. Two revolvers were made, the double-action Hopkins-Allen IXL and the single-action Kerr revolver. The IXL was an American model, likely styled after the Star and the Adams, while the Kerr was British. The Kerr was a 5-rounder with 36 caliber balls, and was most well known for being used by the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. The Kerr was somewhat primitive given its combination of action, caliber, and capacity. This was also a year where new takes on older actions would start to crop up again. The French Jar harmonica pistol would be one such example, and unlike earlier percussive models, this weapon would load 7mm rounds rather than percussion ammunition. This series would be the last series of harmonica pistols and would last until the 1870s. While much safer than the earlier percussion and flintlock harmonicas, it still held all of the same problems, such as the off-weight distribution. The last pistol of note would be the pepperbox-inspired Sharp's Derringer. Now for the late 1850s, this weapon was basically a modernized take on the pepperbox. A 4-round Derringer with a break-open loading method that fires 22 short cartridges. It would go on to see several iterations in the coming years, but started with this one. Developments into revolvers would be continued further into the year of 1860, with another single action from Colt, and the first revolver developments of Prussia. The Colt M1860 Army was intended to be a more modernized 44 caliber Colt, using a paper cartridge and a percussion cap, as the M1860 Army was essentially just a lighter Colt Dragoon. It would be one of the last Colt percussion cap revolvers, as competition from Smith & Wesson, Remington, and later Savage would force Colt to modernize. The Dries Kufal, on the other hand, was a needle-fired double-action from Germany, with a 6-round capacity. It was one of the first organically Prussian revolvers to be made before the late 1870s, and was named for Johann Nikolaus von Dries, inventor of the first bolt-action rifle, the Dries needle gun. The outbreak of the American Civil War over the rights of the Confederate South to maintain slavery resulted in a great deal of revolvers in America in 1861. The first 3 revolvers I must mention are all single actions: the Smith & Wesson Model 2 Army, Savage M1861 Navy, and the Moore revolver. This was around the time the 32 rimfire was created, and the first revolver to use it would be the Smith & Wesson Model 2 Army, which inherited the spur trigger and tip-up frame of the earlier Model 1 Smith & Wesson. The Moore revolver would also be in a 32 caliber, only this time using 32 teat fire instead of rimfire. It would also be the only revolver to do this, but the weapon was not without its merits. Having a 7-round capacity of 32 caliber rounds was quite impressive for the time, as the Smith & Wesson Model 2 Army only had 6 rounds. The final revolver to be mentioned during this period is the Savage 1861 Navy. Savage's first offering being a 36 caliber percussion platform in an age where pistols were transitioning to cartridges was questionable. However, the most questionable part of the Savage has to be its strangely elongated design, resembling the earlier Pettengill, with far more metal tacked on. 1861 was also when Remington's first Derringer, the Zigzag, was released. The Zigzag series of Derringers were chambered in 22 shot, only about 1,000 were actually made, most of which in the transitional revolver style that was falling out of favour by the 1860s. Final mention must go to the Glisenti M1861, the first of Glisenti's revolvers and the one most inspired by the earlier French Lefaucheux series. The weapon is made at the Glisenti factory in Turin, and as of such, is the first Italian development in the repeating handgun space. Formed the same year as the Kingdom of Italy, it would go on to symbolise the newfound ambition of United Italy for its modern design using 11mm pinfire cartridges. 1862 was a special year primarily because it would see the last new percussion revolver developments. From this year on, any new revolvers were going to be chambered in cartridges. The year would see the last of Colt's percussion developments, the M1862 police revolver. This revolver was a single action like many would come to expect, chambered for the 36 caliber, used by Navy and police personnel. This year would also see the Beaumont Adams revolver, an improvement on the now 11-year-old Adams revolver. These revolvers would be formally adopted as they were essentially just improved Dean Adams models, with recoil shields, a single double-action trigger to allow the weapon to be manually cocked, and the weapon was the official revolver of the British Army until 1880. After 1868, with the invention of the 450 Adams cartridge, the later Beaumont Adams revolvers would be cartridge-based instead of percussion-based. No major developments happened in 1863. So I'm moving on to the Slocum revolver of the United States in 1864. Slocum was based in New York, and this weapon would be the most 1860s a revolver could possibly be. 32 rimfire rounds, spur trigger, and was double action. It was a backup weapon for the later stages of the American Civil War. The guns of 1865 would be the Smith & Wesson Model 1.5 and Continental Arms Ladies' Companion. Both of these weapons were highly compact with spur triggers, and the Ladies' Companion seemed to be based on the Smith & Wesson Model 1, given its usage of 22 short ammunition on a pepperbox-styled transitional revolver platform. The weapon was intended for use by women in self-defense scenarios. The Model 1.5 was the first Smith & Wesson revolver to use the top break design, rather than the tip-up design, and as a result it could be more comfortably loaded. It also used 32 rimfire, which seemed to be the bulling cartridge of the 1860s. The year of 1866 produced many famous guns, but besides the Winchester lever-action rifle, the other weapon commonly associated with this year is the Remington Model 95 Derringer. The Model 95 was a single-action Derringer with two barrels in the over-under configuration, chambering 41 short on a spur trigger. The weapon is the archetypal Derringer, and the weapon most people think of when they hear the term Derringer. The weapon would later go on to be cloned in many forms over the course of the 20th century, but must be noted specifically for its cultural influence. The last development of 1866 was the Victor Collet Pepperbox. This is a Belgian weapon by the same creator who made the earlier gravity pistol of 1850, and the pepperbox seen here was odd for its folding trigger, in a time where the spur trigger was starting to become the most popular kind of trigger. It was a double action only, firing 7 to 8mm rounds. 1868 would be an important year in the British world of repeating handguns thanks to the 450 Adams cartridge. This cartridge would be used in 3 key firearms: the Webley Royal Irish Constabulary, a precursor to the Webley Bulldog, the Tranter M1868 Army, a 450 version of the earlier Tranter revolvers, and the Lancaster pistol. While the Lancaster pistol did initially come out in 1860, the 1868 version was the first to be chambered in the 450 Adams cartridge, and this double-action only Howder pistol would be the same one famously used in smaller numbers during the First World War. French developments in 1868 would yield the Galland revolver, noted for being a French double-action with a fast-loading automatic extractor that made it much faster to load than contemporary revolvers at the time. The weapon had variants in 9mm, 7mm, and 12mm. American developments were sparse between 1867 and 1869, but in 1868 the James Reed My Friend Knuckle Duster came out. This was a tiny and obscure 7-round revolver pistol, designed to be as compact as possible, using 22 short. The last development of the 1860s would be the Apache revolver in 1869. This Belgian weapon is famous for its usage by French criminals in the later 19th century, but more than that, the weapon itself was just terrible. Using weak 7mm rounds in a transitional system without a barrel, possessing a short and flimsy bayonet, and functional knuckle dusters that unfortunately had to be attached to the rest of the weapon. Being double action only too, the flimsy trigger was left suspended without a trigger guard. The new decade of the 1870s would begin with the Smith & Wesson Model 3 in 1870. Perhaps the most influential revolver before the end of the First World War, the Smith & Wesson Model 3 was the first standard-issue cartridge-firing revolver in US service, and it did one thing differently from its competitors during the Civil War days. It was quick to load. The 6-round 44 caliber approach was nothing special, but by this point, revolvers were slow to load, and although single actions were usually accurate at range and powerful, if a shot was missed, then that was effectively one less enemy combatant that could have been dispatched. The Model 3 used a tip-down system, making it faster to reload than other revolvers, as the rounds could all be ejected at once, and rounds could be pushed into the cylinder via speed loaders later on into the 1880s and beyond. The Model 3 also innovated by moving away from the ill-fated spur trigger of its older models. Of course, there was one more influential design from 1870, the Gasser M1870. The M1870 was the first of the Gasser revolvers, a series of single-action gate-loading revolvers. The 1870 was chambered for 6 rounds of 11mm and was likely the Austro-Hungarian attempt to match the Italian Glisenti 1861 and Lefaucheux revolvers used by their rival. In 1871, Colt developed 2 new revolvers, both out of desperation given the success of Smith & Wesson's current single-action offerings. The Colt House was developed out of fear. The weapon possessed a spur trigger, like Smith & Wesson's earlier models, and still maintained single-action for gate-loading mechanism. Really the worst of both worlds. This weapon would chamber a 41 rimfire cartridge. The Colt open-top series would develop the same year, with both a pocket and a standard version. The pocket version was more or less just a slower loading Smith & Wesson Model 1, chambered for the same 7 rounds of 22 shot and a single action trigger, only with a slower gate loading approach rather than the tip up or break open of Smith & Wesson's offerings. These revolvers would be the last Colt's offerings until 1873, when Colt saw a resurgence thanks to the Peacemaker. It must be noted that the open top pocket was a very ugly weapon, and was in all reality a downgrade to Smith & Wesson's Model 1 from 14 years prior. 1871 also saw 2 developments from Belgium. These were the Girard revolver and the Lefouche Francotte, which was a collaboration between Belgium and France. The Girard contained a 7-round cylinder of 9mm rounds and was rejected by the Brazilian Empire for service usage over the Mauser C-78 later in the 1880s, while the Lefouche Francotte M71 was chambered for 6 rounds of 11mm ammunition. The M71 would see limited service usage by Sweden, Denmark and Serbia. The last development of 1871 I should mention is the Russian model of Smith & Wesson Model 3 in 44 Russian. This revolver would be used so heavily by the Russians that even after the development of the Nagant M1895, it would still be a popular choice. This variant's last formal military conflict would be the Russian Civil War, and it would see limited usage with Soviet Russia as a reserve pistol in the event a Nagant wasn't available. The first development of 1872 I will talk about is the double-action Webley Bulldog revolver. Unlike its father, the 1868 Webley RSC, this weapon had a 5-round cylinder of 4.42 Webley and a shorter barrel for concealment. While an important development of the Webley brand, especially considering it would go on to be used by the Ottoman Empire in World War I, the pistol is most famous for its use in the assassination of James A. Garfield in 1881. This would also be the same year that the Swiss M1872 revolver would be created. It was a service weapon based on a single/double action platform featuring a 6-round cylinder of 10.4mm rounds. It is not to be confused with the later M1882 Schmidt revolver, but as the first Swiss repeating handgun, it is an extremely modern development for its time. Finally, the 1872 Venditti pistol of Italy. A successor to the American volcanic pistol of the 1850s, this weapon innovates by using 9mm proprietary rounds instead of the rocket ball rounds used on the volcanic pistol. This made the Venditti stronger, and plans existed for a version of the weapon that would have held a 26-round tube magazine rather than the 9-round magazine on the weapon itself. At the start of the 1850s, the most common types of pistol would vary based on the area you were in. In much of the colonial territory occupied by the Americans and the British, revolvers were the military standard, while Caplock single-shot pistols were being phased out. In other European countries and unoccupied territories, they were either gifted American revolvers or used flint and Caplock pistols primarily. By the end of the 1850s, many developments had occurred that would permanently shift the direction of revolvers. With the expiration of the Colt patent, faster loading revolvers like the Smith & Wesson Model 1 would emerge, and percussion cap revolvers were made standard for most of the world at this point, with France taking the first leaps and bounds into military-issue cartridge loaders. During the 1860s, a notable shift occurred towards cartridge-fed revolvers, especially in Italy, Britain, France and America, and to a smaller extent Germany and Belgium. Of course, most of these weapons were in small quantities and were fairly experimental, but given that production of new percussion designs had all but dried up by 1862, it showed where the direction of guns was headed. By the early 1870s, countries like Russia and Switzerland too were embracing the cartridge future of firearms, with the highly influential Smith & Wesson Model 3 making an immediate impression, thanks to its fast-loading cylinder and use of powerful metallic centerfire cartridges. After the development of the Smith & Wesson Model 3, the priority of repeating handguns shifted from the older mentality of the early Colt revolvers, where a soldier was simply lucky to even have more than 1 shot per pistol, to a mentality where reloading needed to be quick, to allow soldiers to take out more soldiers than their cylinder capacity would usually allow. In the next episode of the History of Repeating Handguns, I will be discussing the period between 1873 and 1895, where the Colt Peacemaker would emerge to save Colt from their growing despair, following the growing power of Remington and Smith & Wesson, in an age where cartridges were now the norm, and designs were striving not only to be the fastest and most powerful, but also the safest, and where semi-automatic pistols would crawl from the primordial soup of the early 1890s. Until then, I hope this video on the period of 1851 to 1872 has been informative.